What if I told you the most famous betrayal in history never had to happen? What if 30 pieces of silver had remained untouched? What if the kiss that changed humanity's destiny had never been given? Have you ever stopped to think that the entire foundation of Christianity, the entire narrative of salvation, the entire promise of redemption is built upon an act of betrayal? But what would happen if that act never existed? Today we're exploring an alternate timeline where Judas Iscariot chose a different path. And brace yourself, because this journey will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, destiny, and free will. Stay until the end, because the final revelation will blow your mind. Picture the scene. Jerusalem, Passover week, the air thick with messianic expectation. Jesus walks through the streets knowing his time is near. But in this alternate reality, something fundamental is different. Judas, the treasurer of the 12, the man we know as the traitor, faces his crossroads and chooses differently. The 30 pieces of silver offered by the priests remain in their pouches. The agreement in the shadows is never sealed. The betrayal that should have defined generations simply doesn't happen. But here's the question that will haunt you. If Judas doesn't betray Jesus, who does? Or does anyone need to? Because look, the prophecies speak of suffering, speak of sacrifice, speak of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of the world. But do they specify that this servant needed to be betrayed by a friend? Or was betrayal just one of the possible paths to an inevitable destiny? In this alternate timeline, the Last Supper happens completely differently. There's no tense moment where Jesus declares that one of those present will betray him. There are no suspicious glances among the disciples. There's no Judas rushing out into the dark night. Instead, there's complete unity. The 12 remain together, sharing bread and wine, hearing their master's final words without the imminent shadow of betrayal staining every word.
Gethsemane in this reality becomes something completely different. Jesus still goes there to pray, still faces the agony of knowing what's coming, still sweats drops of blood in deep spiritual anguish. But when night advances, there's no crowd with torches and swords. There's no Judas guiding the temple guards. There's no infamous kiss marking the Messiah for arrest. So what happens? The religious authorities still want to silence Jesus. They still see him as a threat to their power and the established order. But without an inside informant, without someone who knows Jesus' exact movements, the capture becomes more complicated. Perhaps they wait until the next day. Perhaps they arrest Jesus publicly in the temple, transforming the arrest into a spectacle before all of Jerusalem instead of a secret nighttime operation. Or perhaps, and here the story gets really fascinating, Jesus surrenders voluntarily. Without the need to be betrayed, he simply walks to the authorities and declares who he is. There's no victim of betrayal in this scenario, only a voluntary victim. The sacrifice becomes even purer, even more intentional, stripped of the moral complexity of having been handed over by a friend. But wait, because here's where theology begins to crumble and rebuild itself simultaneously. The crucifixion still happens, because the cross didn't depend on Judas. It depended on a corrupt system of political and religious power. Pilate would still wash his hands, the Pharisees would still cry for blood, the crowd would still shout, "Crucify him." But the narrative changes profoundly. Without Judas as the scapegoat of betrayal, on whom does the blame fall? The Gospels have always carried this tension between holding the Jewish religious leaders responsible, the Roman authorities, or recognizing that it was collective human sin that drove the nails. But the figure of Judas always allowed us to focus betrayal on one individual, one man we can point to and say, there stands the real culprit. Without that convenient target, we're forced to confront a more uncomfortable truth, that we are all Judas, that every sin is betrayal, that every time we choose ego over love, we're handing Christ over again. The absence of historical Judas makes his theological presence even more universal and personal. And here's something that will give you chills. In our real timeline, Judas hanged himself, consumed by remorse. His bowels spilled out in a field bought with blood money. But in this alternate reality, Judas is among the disciples at the foot of the cross. He witnesses the suffering that, in our timeline, he caused. How does this transform his psychology? How does this transform his future ministry? 3 days later, the tomb is still empty. The resurrection happens because it never depended on how Jesus died, but on who he was. Victory over death didn't require prior betrayal, it only required death and divinity. But the 12 disciples who witnessed the resurrected Christ are different. In our timeline, they carried collective guilt. They had abandoned Jesus, denied knowing him, fled in fear. Peter especially carried the weight of triple denial. But all somehow shared in the guilt because they didn't stop Judas, didn't protect their master. In this alternate timeline, although they still demonstrated cowardice by fleeing during the arrest and crucifixion, there's a different dynamic. They remain 12. There's no vacancy left by a traitor's suicide. There's no need to choose Matthias to complete the number. Apostolic continuity remains intact from the beginning. Comment: do you think Judas could have become a great apostle? And Judas himself, imagine the impact. He would be a witness to the resurrection without the weight of betrayal. He could have become a powerful evangelist, perhaps the most powerful of all, because he would be remembered not as a redeemed traitor, but as the faithful one who remained until the end. The letters of Judas in the New Testament could rival Paul's in influence.
Early Christianity develops with a slightly different foundation. The salvation narrative remains. Jesus died for our sins and rose again, but the emphasis shifts. Without Judas's story as a warning against betrayal and greed, what other lessons become central? Perhaps the early church would focus more intensely on Christ's voluntary choice to suffer. Perhaps the theology of free will versus predestination would take a completely different course because a crucial question remains unanswered. If prophecies said the Messiah would be betrayed and Judas didn't betray him, were the prophecies wrong or misinterpreted? This opens a fascinating theological abyss. Either we recognize that prophecies were conditional, based on free human choices that could have been different, or we admit that some prophecies were later constructions, written after events to make sense of them. Both options challenge fundamentalisms and demand a more mature and complex faith. Christian art through the centuries would be radically different. There would be no The Kiss of Judas by Giotto. There would be no representations of Judas with a bag of coins in Last Supper paintings. All betrayal iconography simply wouldn't exist. In its place, perhaps art would focus more on the disciples' solidarity, on the heroic choice to remain faithful, even in the face of mortal threat. So what really changes? Theologically, salvation remains intact because it never depended on how Jesus got to the cross, but on what he did on it and beyond it. Atonement, reconciliation between God and humanity, substitutionary sacrifice, all of this remains operational. But psychologically and culturally, everything changes. We lose the cautionary tale about betrayal that echoed for 2,000 years. We lose the cultural archetype of the supreme traitor, the name Judas that became synonymous with betrayal in all languages. But we gain something too. We gain a story of universal redemption without exceptions, where even the one who could have been the greatest traitor chose a different path. This journey through alternate history reveals a profound truth. The gospel doesn't depend on specific villains. It depends on the divine choice of sacrificial love and the human response to that love. Judas or no Judas, the cross remains, the resurrection remains, hope remains. If this video expanded your mind and challenged your theological certainties, you need to subscribe now, because we're just beginning a series of alternate biblical timelines that will revolutionize your understanding of faith, destiny, and meaning. In the next episode, what if Abraham had refused to sacrifice Isaac? Click the subscribe button before leaving, because content like this doesn't appear every day, and when it does, you'll want to be the first to know. Comment now which alternate timeline you want to see explored. Your participation shapes our content. Until the next revelation.